people who want to know what sort of morality to follow also want to know, is there any reason for following it? And that's what atheists, I think, lack. I mean, there isn't
So
reason.
in other words, a religious person who takes the same persuasion as yourself might think that the reason why I want to do a good act is because I'm being told to, whereas someone like myself can say that the reason I want to do a good thing is because I believe it to be good. And again, we're trying to discuss which of these is the bankrupt moral system, and I think that, there's no contest there.
Well, what you're doing is you, as an atheist, would say that something is good because you believe it to be good. My point is, what's the basis of your belief that it's good? Is it just your intuition?
So we need to talk about what is the standard of good, and this is why I
Yeah.
wanted to bring you back to the euthyphro dilemma, which you mentioned.
Right.
And I wanted to just clarify your answer to anybody who's not familiar. In Plato's Euthyphro, the question is asked: are things good because God commands them, or does He command them because they're good? And what would your answer to that question be?
Straightforwardly, it was Plato's answer that God commands things because they're good.
Okay, so what that indicates to me is that if God commands things because they're good, there is a standard of good that exists outside of God, because good becomes a property of something that exists independently of God. Because to say that God does something because it's good.
That's the way the dilemma is put, but actually the religious response to that, or the theistic response to that, is to say that there is a standard of goodness. It is necessarily what it is, but it is internal to God.
Okay.
So you define God in terms of good. So
I'm
with you if you're saying you know what is good independently of God. I agree with that. And so you do know what is good independently of God. Okay.
When you say that, you mean we can have a conception of good that is separable from the notion of God?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I do. There's no argument. I concede that straight away.
Sure, but
my question is, why should anybody care about that?
Exactly, but the same question could be asked of you, right? If you say that good is kind of a descriptive property of God, it's like saying that it's a property that belongs to something, like redness belonging to a table, right? There's nothing in a descriptive quality like redness that has any normative function. And similarly, why should a descriptive quality of goodness, as applied to God, have any kind of normative function? I could return the question to you and say, why ought I do what God commands?
It's a good philosophical point, but which I disagree with, because if you say no descriptive property can have normative force, then if I said this room's on fire, it would have pretty immediate normative force.
I disagree with you.
Disagree? Oh,
yeah.
You don't just sit here and say, well, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, of course, you need the hidden premise that we ought to avoid burning rooms.
Yeah, we don't. Well, okay.
Well, we may not need it to react upon it. Like, we may not need it instinctively, is what I mean to say. But in order to philosophically justify why you should leave the room, if you just said, well, the building's on fire, and I could just say, well, why should that mean we need to leave? It's like, well, we need to avoid being hurt. Okay, why do we need to avoid being hurt? You need the normative premise that we should avoid pain, that we should avoid burning alive, something like that. Yeah. Without that, you don't get philosophically to the end of saying we should leave the room.
But many descriptions involve in themselves a normative premise. Like if I say, I'm hungry, well, that's a description of what I am, but it's in itself normative. It means I want some food, and I'd be stupid not to try and get some food if I could.
Now, hold on. You can say that saying I'm hungry is equivalent to saying I want some food, okay, but that still is just a descriptive statement. I want some food. Okay, why ought you do what you want?
I don't agree with separating off the normative from the descriptive. The case I used in my 10-minute introduction was loving a person. And you may say that this is a person I love, and that's a descriptive statement. I love this person. But if it's true, you don't appeal to a premise that I ought to do what people I love tell me. You don't appeal to that. You automatically do it.
Yeah, you may not appeal to it, but it needs to be there implicitly.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying that saying there is a God is saying there is an objective moral standard of goodness. That's part of what we were saying. If you want to say that's separate from a description of God, well, all right. But the norm is built into the description.
I still disagree with the point. I think, yes, you can say that God is or provides well, I suppose it wouldn't provide because, again, it's independent, but God has this objective kind of quality of goodness. But the question still remains, why ought you do what is good? And now, I don't necessarily think there's an answer to this question, but I'm saying if the criticism of atheistic morality is that you have no reason to believe why you ought to act in a certain way in accordance with a certain normative fact, then I could say the same thing to you. If I have no reason in the same way that if I said, well, my atheistic morality is based upon, if this room caught in fire, well, we all know that we should leave the room. You know, it's obvious we ought to leave the room. Then you would quite rightly say, but there's no ontological basis for that. That's just your instinct, right? What's the actual philosophical meat of the argument that we should leave the room? And I just want the same thing from you.